Mr. Pendleton, are we present in mind as well as body this morning?
The voice of District Judge Davies cut through the stuffy air of Oakhaven Magistrates' Court, sharp and needlessly loud. It was a voice that enjoyed the sound of its own echo against the dark, lacquered wood panels that lined the room, a room that smelled faintly of old paper, floor polish, and a century of petty grievances. Davies, a man whose fleshy face was framed by a pair of aggressively modern spectacles, leaned forward on his bench. He looked less like a dispenser of justice and more like a frustrated headmaster about to cane a particularly stubborn pupil. He peered down at the man standing alone in the dock, a man who seemed to have been carved from a different, quieter era. Arthur Pendelton did not stir. He was 82 years old, and he stood with a stillness that was utterly at odds with the fidgeting energy of the courtroom. His back was as straight as the day he'd enlisted, a rigid line of defiance against the gentle slope of age. He wore a tweed jacket, the elbows worn to a soft shine, and a faded regimental tie knotted neatly at his throat. His hands, gnarled with arthritis but spotlessly clean, were clasped calmly behind his back. He looked thin, almost fragile, yet he occupied his space with a sense of rootedness that made the judge, for all his bluster, seem temporary.
Yes, Your Honor,
Arthur said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a certain gravelly weight, like stones rolling in a slow tide. It was clear, concise, and offered nothing more than what was asked. A theatrical sigh escaped Judge Davies. He made a great show of it for the benefit of the smattering of people in the public gallery, a few law students, a couple of bored locals, and a young man in a cheap suit scribbling in a notepad.
Excellent. Progress at last,
The judge muttered, then addressed the prosecutor.
Mr. Finch, let's get on with it, shall we? My diary isn't getting any shorter.
Mr. Finch,
A young man with a nervous Adam's apple that danced above his collar jumped to his feet. Of course, Your Honor. The charge concerns a violation of Section 12 of the Oakhaven Civic Amenities Act of 1988 regarding the proper maintenance of a residential property. The defendant, Mr. Arthur Pendelton of 24 Chestnut Lane, has been issued with 3 formal notices over the past 6 months concerning the state of his front garden. The notices, I can confirm, were ignored. Davies tapped an immaculate fingernail on his desk. The sound was a sharp, impatient little beat in the otherwise silent room. An overgrown garden. Is that the summit of it, Mr. Finch? We have actual criminals to deal with today. The complaint from the counsel cites a significant level of neglect, Finch clarified, shuffling his papers. Overgrown lawn, weeds obscuring the footpath, and a fence in a state of disrepair. The property, Your Honor, has become an eyesore. The word hung in the air, ugly and accusatory. An eyesore. Arthur's gaze remained fixed on the coat of arms mounted on the wall behind the judge's head. His expression didn't change, but inside him, something tightened. He wasn't seeing the courtroom anymore. He was seeing the garden as it was just this morning, drenched in the soft autumn light. He saw the wild climbing roses his Evelyn had planted, now reaching their thorny arms over the sagging fence posts he'd promised her he would fix. He saw the riot of bluebells and forget-me-nots she'd adored, now mixed with dandelions and clover, a wild tapestry of her own design. Every uncut blade of grass, every peeling slat of wood, was a testament to her. It was the last thing she had touched, the last piece of the world that was exactly as she had left it. How could he explain to these people, who saw only regulations and violations, that tidying his garden felt like erasing the last fading sentence of a love letter? An eyesore, Judge Davies repeated, savoring the word. He turned his attention back to Arthur. Well, Mr. Pendleton, the counsel says your garden is an eyesore, a straightforward accusation. And your response to these 3 notices has been, to put it mildly, nothing. How do you plead? Arthur's eyes drifted from the coat of arms and met the judge's. They were pale blue, the color of a winter sky, and held a profound weariness. Not guilty, Your Honor. A quiet scoff came from Finch. Judge Davies leaned back, a flicker of genuine annoyance crossing his face. This wasn't the usual script. Normally, people in this situation were apologetic, flustered, full of excuses. This old man's calm was a disruption. It felt somehow like a challenge to his authority. "Not guilty," Davies said, his voice dripping with incredulity. "Mr. Pendleton, the prosecutor has photographs. I have them right here. Unless you are planning to argue that these images of something resembling a lost jungle in the Amazon are a fabrication, I fail to see what grounds you have for such a plea." He was baiting him now, trying to crack the stoic facade. He wanted a reaction. He wanted fear or deference, or at the very least, a rambling excuse he could swat down. He didn't get one. Arthur remained silent for a long moment. He could feel the impatience of the judge like a physical pressure. He understood what was required of him, a plea for pity, an explanation about his wife, a promise to do better. But the words felt cheap and hollow. The truth of his inaction was too heavy for this small, stuffy room. It was a private, sacred thing, and this man with his sharp voice and cold eyes had no right to it. The silence stretched, becoming louder and more defiant than any shout. The judge's face began to flush a dull, angry red. "Answer the question, Mr. Pendleton," Davies snapped, his voice losing its theatricality and gaining a genuine edge. "Why did you not respond to the counsel's notices? Why have you allowed your property to fall into such a state? What, man, is your explanation?" Arthur took a slow, deliberate breath. He could hear the low hum of the fluorescent lights above, could feel the slight draft coming from the ill-fitting window. He thought of Evelyn's laughter as she'd planted those ridiculously bright red poppies along the path. "They're cheerful, Arthur," she'd said. "Every home needs a bit of cheerful." He looked at the judge, a man who dealt not in cheerfulness but in compliance. He gave the only answer he could. "I couldn't." "Couldn't?" Judge Davies repeated the word as if it were a foreign object he'd found in his soup. He took off his modern spectacles and began polishing them with a small, pristine cloth, his movements slow and deliberate. It was a gesture designed to convey immense, weary patience, but the tight set of his jaw betrayed him. What it really conveyed was a deep, simmering anger. "You couldn't," he said again, placing the glasses back on his nose with a precise click. "Mr. Pendleton, this is a court of law, not a philosopher's salon. We deal in facts and specifics. The counsel requires you to trim your hedge. Are you telling this court that you are physically incapable of operating a pair of shears?" The question was a deliberate trap, laced with mockery. He was painting Arthur as either a liar or a senile old man. The prosecutor, Mr. Finch, saw his moment. He cleared his throat, gathering his papers with a nervous rustle that seemed to echo in the tense quiet. "Your Honor, if I may," Finch began, his voice a little too eager. "We have the photographic evidence mentioned previously, submitted by the counsel's enforcement officer." He passed a slim folder up to the clerk, who in turn passed it to the judge. Davies flicked the folder open. He glanced at the first photo, then the second, his expression hardening into a mask of professional disapproval. "Indeed," he said, holding up one of the pictures for Arthur to see, though it was too far away to be clear. "A veritable jungle. Roses being choked by what I can only assume are grade-A prize-winning nettles. A lawn that appears to be auditioning for a role as a nature reserve. And a fence that looks like it surrendered about a decade ago." Arthur didn't look at the photograph. He didn't need to. He had the original image burned into his mind. He knew the exact rose bush Davies was talking about. It was an Evelyn's glory, a pale pink climbing rose his wife had planted on their 10th anniversary. He remembered the day vividly. The sun had been warm on his back, the smell of freshly turned earth filling the air. Evelyn had been laughing, her hands covered in soil, a smudge of dirt on her cheek that he had gently wiped away. "It'll outlast us, Arthur," she'd said, patting the soil down around the roots. "This one's a survivor." Now, here was this man, in this sterile, airless room, mocking its resilience, calling its fight for survival neglect. "So I will ask you again, Mr. Pendleton." The judge pressed on, his voice like a drill. "You have heard the charge, you have seen the evidence, you have pleaded not guilty, and your entire defense rests on the frankly baffling statement that you couldn't comply. This court requires a better explanation than that. Why did you not maintain your property?" Arthur's gaze remained steady, but his mind was in the garden with Evelyn. He could almost feel the phantom warmth of the sun, hear the distant hum of a lawn-mower from a neighbor's garden, a sound from a lifetime ago. He knew he had to give this man something. He had to offer up a piece of his quiet grief to satisfy the court's hunger for a reason. He owed it to Evelyn to at least try. He took a slow breath, the stale courtroom air a poor substitute for the scent of roses. "My wife," he began, his voice low and even. "Evelyn. She passed 6 months ago." He laid the words out simply, like placing stones on a grave. There was no tremor in his voice, no appeal for sympathy. It was a fact. For Arthur, that fact explained everything. The overgrown garden, the peeling fence, the silence. It was all rooted in that one catastrophic event. For a moment, a genuine silence fell over the court. The young man in the cheap suit stopped scribbling in his notepad. The prosecutor, Finch, had the decency to look down at his shoes. Judge Davies was momentarily thrown. This was a detail he hadn't been expecting. A messy human emotion intruding on his tidy world of bylaws and citations. But he recovered quickly. "The court offers its condolences, of course," he said, the words perfectly formed but utterly hollow. It was the tone of a man reading a script. Then, without missing a beat, he pivoted. "However, Mr. Pendleton, while a sad event, personal circumstances do not place one above their civic responsibilities. The law, you see, applies to everyone, equally." He leaned forward, sensing a legal opening. "In fact, one could argue you are now making the council's case for them. You are admitting that for 6 months you have been unable to maintain your property. That is the very definition of neglect, is it not? 6 months is more than enough time to grieve and then hire a gardener." The coldness of it was breathtaking. Davies had taken Arthur's most profound pain and reframed it as an admission of guilt. He had twisted a monument to love into a civic violation. Arthur felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had faced men with guns and knives, men whose eyes burned with hatred. But there was something uniquely cruel about this man, who used the law as a weapon to dismantle a person's dignity, piece by piece, right here in a quiet English courtroom. He thought of his last promise to Evelyn. She'd been in her bed by the window, looking out at the garden she could no longer tend. Her voice had been a whisper, thin as paper. "Don't let them make it tidy, Arthur," she'd said, a faint smile on her lips. "Let it be wild for a bit. Let it remember me." How could he possibly explain that to Judge Davies? How could he translate a deathbed promise into a language the court would understand? He couldn't. So he remained silent. His silence was the wrong move. To Davies, it was a confirmation of his own superiority. It was insolence. "Look at me when I am speaking to you, Mr. Pendleton," the judge commanded, his voice sharp with irritation. "I am trying to be reasonable here. I am trying to understand why this is so difficult. But you sit there in your own little world, offering nothing. This is not a social club. This is a court. And in it, you will show respect." The accusation was absurd. Arthur had spent his entire life living by a code of respect, discipline, and honor that this judge could never possibly comprehend. He had shown respect to his queen, his country, his regiment, and his wife. He had respected the flag that was now draped limply in the corner of this dreary room. The idea that this man, this petty tyrant in a robe, was lecturing him on respect was a violation far deeper than any overgrown lawn. But still, he said nothing. He simply met the judge's angry gaze, and it was this, his unbreakable, quiet dignity that was pushing Judge Davies closer and closer to the edge. In the third row of the public gallery, Liam Connor stopped scribbling in his notepad. He was a trainee solicitor, barely 5 months into his training contract with a local firm, and this was his third mandatory court observation. The first 2 had been a blur of speeding tickets and minor public order offenses, and frankly, this case had started out just as dreary. His initial notes were clinical, detached. Pendleton, AOAP versus counsel, Regarden. Defendant, non-compliant. Cites, recent bereavement. He'd been about to chalk it up as another sad but straightforward case of an old man letting things go. But something was holding his attention. Something was off. It was the way the old man stood. Liam had spent countless Sundays as a boy watching his granddad, a former para himself, standing exactly like that in his own garden, staring at his prize-winning leeks. Ramrod straight, feet planted shoulder-width apart, hands clasped behind the back. It wasn't the posture of a defiant pensioner. It was a military stance, ingrained and unconscious. It was the way a soldier stands at ease, a posture of disciplined waiting that decades of civilian life had failed to erase. A knot of unease tightened in Liam's stomach. He looked from the old soldier in the dock to the preening judge on the bench. He had listened to Judge Davies's cold, bureaucratic dismissal of the old man's grief, and a slow, hot anger had begun to creep up his neck. His own granddad, a man of few words and immense pride, had passed away 2 years ago. Liam could vividly imagine the old man's fury if some jumped-up official had dared to speak to him with such open contempt. This proceeding was starting to feel deeply, fundamentally wrong. It wasn't justice. It was bullying. Judge Davies was now letting the silence hang, a weapon he was using to try and break the old soldier. But it wasn't working. Arthur Pendelton's calm was a fortress, and Davies was just hurling insults at its impenetrable walls. The judge's face was becoming a mottled canvas of pink and white, a clear sign his professional facade was cracking. He scanned Arthur from head to toe, his eyes filled with a petty, searching animosity. He was looking for a chink in the armor, any sign of weakness he could exploit. And then he found one, or at least he thought he did. His eyes narrowed, fixing on a point on the old man's tweed lapel. "And what, may I ask, is that?" he sneered, pointing a contemptuous finger. Liam followed the judge's gesture. He saw a small, tarnished object pinned to the worn fabric of Arthur's jacket. It was barely noticeable, a dull piece of metal that didn't catch the light. "Is that some sort of club pin, Mr. Pendleton?" Davies pressed, his voice dripping with condescension. "From the local British Legion, perhaps? Or did you win a prize at the village fete? A prize for the best-kept weeds, maybe?" A few sycophantic titters came from the front of the court. The prosecutor, Finch, gave a weak, obsequious smile. Davies leaned further over his bench, his voice rising. "You think a little pin from your bowls club gives you the right to stand there in silent judgment of this court. You think it puts you above the law that the rest of us have to follow." The insult was cheap, but it was designed to humiliate, to reduce a man's life to a trivial hobby, to strip him of his dignity in front of strangers. Liam watched Arthur closely, expecting him to finally crack, to shout, to protest. He did none of those things. But Liam, now hyper-focused on the old soldier, saw something no one else did. He saw the old man's hands, clasped behind his back, tighten ever so slightly, the knuckles turning white for a fraction of a second. He saw a flicker in those pale blue eyes, a momentary flash of a cold, hard light that was gone as quickly as it came. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, something far more dangerous. It was the look of a man whose sacred ground had just been trespassed upon. The judge, oblivious, plowed on. "I am losing my patience. Your contemptuous attitude is noted. Now, for the final time, I am asking you to address the charge." But Liam wasn't listening to the judge anymore. His entire being was focused on that tiny, unassuming pin on Arthur's lapel. The judge's words had drawn his attention to it, and now he couldn't look away. It was small, circular, with something in the center, a shape he almost recognized, a shape he had seen countless times in a dusty box of his grandfather's most treasured possessions. His breath caught in his throat. His heart began to hammer against his ribs with a sudden, frantic rhythm. He leaned forward in his seat, his half-written notes forgotten, his eyes squinting, trying to cut through the gloom of the courtroom. The distance was too great, the pin too small, but a shocking, impossible thought had just ignited in his mind. It couldn't be. Surely not. Not here. Not this quiet old man with the overgrown garden. Could it? The voice of Judge Davies had faded to a dull, meaningless drone in the background. For Liam Connor, the stuffy, wood-paneled courtroom had shrunk to a single, tiny point of focus, the tarnished pin on the old man's lapel. Time itself seemed to slow down, the seconds stretching into long, syrupy strands. He held his breath, his eyes straining. A sliver of watery autumn sunlight lanced through one of the tall, grimy windows, and, for a fleeting second, it struck the pin. The dull metal flashed, and in that flash, Liam saw it. It wasn't a trick of the light. The image was suddenly, shockingly clear. Bellerophon, the hero of ancient myth, mounted on the back of the winged horse Pegasus. Liam's blood ran cold. The air punched out of his lungs in a silent gasp. The notepad slipped from his suddenly numb fingers and fell to the floor with a soft clatter that no one else seemed to notice. His mind was violently thrown back in time, not weeks or months, but years. He was 8 years old again, sitting cross-legged on the shag pile carpet of his grandfather's study. The air in the memory was thick with the scent of pipe tobacco and brasso polish. In his lap was his granddad's heavy wooden box, and laid out on a piece of velvet inside were the treasures, heavy, gleaming medals on colorful ribbons and a handful of small, regimental pins. His grandfather, a man whose hands were as tough as old leather but whose touch was always gentle, had picked up the very same pin. "This one's special, Liam." The old man's voice echoed in his memory, a low, gravelly rumble. "That's our mark. The badge of the parachute regiment. Pegasus. It's for the lads who are brave enough, or daft enough, to jump out of a perfectly good aeroplane. You don't ever forget that, see?" He had never forgotten. He was back in the courtroom, his heart hammering a frantic, panicked rhythm against his ribs. The posture, the unbreakable calm under fire, and now the pin. It all clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a veteran. This was a para. Arthur Pendelton was one of the men his grandfather had spoken of with a reverence reserved for saints and legends. And judging by his age, he would have served during the same brutal, bloody conflict his granddad had fought in. The Falklands. A cold dread, sharp and absolute, washed over Liam. He looked at Judge Davies, who was now puffing out his chest, preparing to deliver his final, crushing verdict. He looked at the bored faces in the gallery, the smirking prosecutor. None of them knew. They were sitting here, casually dismantling the dignity of a man who had likely walked through fire and fought for the very freedoms that allowed them to do so. The injustice of it was a physical sickness, a coiling serpent in his gut. "And given your continued refusal to engage with these proceedings," Judge Davies's voice cut through Liam's panicked thoughts, sharp and final, "your blatant disrespect for the authority of this court, I am left with no alternative. I hereby find you in contempt of court." No. The word screamed in Liam's mind. "Bailiff," the judge commanded, pointing a regal finger towards the dock. "Take this man into custody. A night in the cells might just teach him the value of a civil tongue." That was it. The trigger. The point of no return. Liam didn't even think. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. He snatched his notepad, shoved it into his jacket pocket, and practically bolted from his seat. He stumbled past the knees of the other observers, ignoring their irritated glances, and pushed open the heavy courtroom doors, stumbling out into the echoing quiet of the main hall. The air out here was cool, and he leaned against the cold marble of the wall, his legs feeling weak. His hands were trembling so violently he could barely unlock his phone. He scrolled frantically through his contacts, his mind racing. Who could he call? The police? They wouldn't interfere with the judge. The council? Useless. He needed someone who would understand, someone who would grasp the monumental wrongness of what was happening in a single sentence. His finger hovered over the number for his firm's senior partner, then dismissed it. They'd tell him to sit down and shut up. Then he remembered. A week ago, for a minor planning dispute case, he'd had to call the administrative office at the local army barracks, Oakhaven Garrison. The number was still in his recent calls. It was a crazy 1-in-a-million long shot, but it was the only one he had. He pressed the button. The phone rang once, twice. Oakhaven Garrison, reception, how can I help you? A crisp, professional voice answered. I need to speak to the commanding officer. Liam stammered, his voice breathless and urgent. Brigadier Blackwood. There was a pause. I'm afraid the brigadier is in a meeting, sir. Can I take a message? No, you don't understand. Liam insisted, his voice cracking with desperation. He could picture the bailiff approaching Arthur right now. Time was running out. It's an emergency, a real one. Please, you have to listen to me. They're in the magistrate's court in town. They're about to lock up an old soldier, a man named Arthur Pendelton. Sir, that is a civil matter, the receptionist said, her tone shifting to dismissive. I can give you the number for the Royal British Legion if you... He's a para. Liam practically shouted into the phone, turning heads in the hall. He's wearing the Pegasus pin. I think he's a Falklands veteran. They're putting him in a cell over his bloody garden. The receptionist's professional armor finally cracked. There was another silence, this one different, less dismissive, more uncertain. Sir, even if that's true, I can't just interrupt the brigadier. Liam's mind was on fire, searching for the magic words. What was it his granddad used to say? The name of the battle he never wanted to talk about, the one that was whispered with awe. Goose Green, he blurted out. Please, just get a message to him. Tell him they're about to put a sergeant from Goose Green in a cage. Arthur Pendelton, please. For the love of God, please. The change on the other end of the line was instantaneous. The hesitation vanished, replaced by a clipped military urgency. Say that name again. Pendleton. Sergeant Arthur Pendleton. Stay where you are, sir, the voice commanded, sharp and clear. Do not move. I'm putting you through. The line clicked. A muffled exchange could be heard. Liam held the phone to his ear with a white-knuckled grip, his back pressed hard against the cold marble wall. He had just thrown a grenade into the middle of Judge Davies's tidy little courtroom. Now, all he could do was pray for the explosion. Brigadier James Blackwood, commander of the 16th Infantry Brigade, was having a thoroughly miserable day. He was sitting at the head of a polished mahogany table in his office at Oakhaven Garrison, trying to explain the concept of operational readiness to a senior civil servant from the Ministry of Defense. The man, whose name was Peterson, had the soft hands and unwavering self-assurance of someone who had never spent a single night sleeping in the rain. He was talking about budget cuts, using phrases like efficiency savings and resource reallocation. To Blackwood, it sounded like he was describing how to methodically dismantle a castle brick by brick while insisting it would make the walls stronger. So, you see, Brigadier, Peterson was saying, with a small, patronizing smile. If we trim the fat from the logistical support units, we can divert those funds to the more, shall we say, kinetic elements of the brigade. Blackwood resisted the urge to rub his temples. Trimming the fat meant sacking mechanics and radio operators, the very people who kept his kinetic elements from grinding to a halt. He was about to deliver a carefully worded but brutally direct rebuttal when a sharp rap came at the door. Before he could answer, the door opened and his aide, a young, ferociously competent captain by the name of Evans, stepped inside. This was a grave breach of protocol. Evans knew the brigadier was not to be disturbed during this meeting. "This had better be important, Captain," Blackwood said, his voice a low growl. The look in his eyes could freeze water. Captain Evans, pale and holding a single sheet of paper, didn't flinch, but his urgency was palpable. "Sir, I apologize for the interruption. Mr. Peterson, my apologies. Sir, a priority call was just patched through from a civilian in town. I thought you needed to hear this immediately." Blackwood's annoyance hardened. "A civilian call? Evans, are you telling me you interrupted a meeting with the MOD for—" "He's at the magistrate's court, sir," Evans cut in, his voice low and tight. "He says they're about to put a man in a holding cell. An old soldier from the parachute regiment." Blackwood's expression didn't soften. Oakhaven was a garrison town. There were thousands of veterans. Many of them, sadly, fell on hard times. While he supported the service charities, he couldn't personally intervene in every civil case. "That's a matter for the Legion, Captain, you know that." "Yes, sir." But the caller mentioned the man's name. Arthur Pendelton. The name meant nothing to Blackwood. He was about to dismiss Evans with a final, furious glare when the captain added the last piece of information. "He also mentioned the name of a battle, sir." Goose Green. The world stopped. The air in the immaculate, climate-controlled office seemed to vanish. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner fell silent. Peterson's droning voice, the rustle of papers, the distant sound of soldiers training on the parade ground. It all faded into a profound, ringing silence. Brigadier James Blackwood froze, his hand hovering over a water glass, his knuckles bone white. The color drained from his face, leaving behind the waxy pallor of a man who has seen a ghost. And in his mind's eye, a ghost appeared. The polished mahogany table dissolved into the freezing, mud-soaked earth of the Falkland Islands, 1982. He was no longer a brigadier in a pristine uniform. He was a terrified 22-year-old second lieutenant, his legs shattered by Argentinian mortar shrapnel. The air, thick with the smell of cordite and wet grass, screamed with the crack of rifle fire and the roar of low-flying jets. He was alone, pinned down behind a pathetic mound of gorse, his blood soaking into the frigid ground. He was going to die here, thousands of miles from home. Through the swirling smoke, a figure emerged, moving with a calm, lethal economy of motion. It was his platoon sergeant, a man who seemed impossibly old to the young lieutenant, probably all of 35. His face was a mask of camouflage paint, grime and blood, but his eyes were clear and steady. Sergeant Pendelton. "All right, sir," the sergeant had grunted, ignoring the bullets snapping past his head as if they were annoying insects. "Looks like you're in a bit of a mess." "My leg. I can't move," Blackwood had gasped, his voice thin with shock and fear. Pendleton had given a grim nod. "No worries, sir. We'll have you out of here in a tick." And with a strength that seemed inhuman, the sergeant had hoisted the 6-foot officer onto his shoulders and began a staggering, weaving run back towards the British lines, away from the machine gun nest that had them zeroed. The last thing young Blackwood remembered before passing out from the pain was the sergeant setting him down behind cover, giving him a quick, reassuring nod, and then turning to run back into the thick of the fighting. Back into hell. The memory vanished as quickly as it came. Blackwood was back in his office. Peterson was staring at him, a confused frown on his face. Captain Evans stood rigid, waiting. The brigadier placed his glass down on the table with a quiet, deliberate click. He stood up, his 5'11" frame suddenly seeming to fill the entire room. His eyes, when he looked at his aide, were chips of ice. The petty anger was gone, replaced by a fury so cold and so absolute, it was terrifying to behold. "Get my car," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "To the front of this building, now." "Sir?" Evans asked, startled by the intensity. "And get me my number ones, full-dress uniform, service cap, medals, the lot. I want it laid out in my changing room 5 minutes ago." Peterson, the man from the MOD, finally found his voice. "Brigadier, really, in the middle of our briefing? What could possibly be so—" Blackwood turned his head and fixed Peterson with a stare so venomous the man physically recoiled in his chair. "Mr. Peterson," the brigadier said, his voice shaking with a tightly controlled rage, "the briefing is over. You are welcome to see yourself out. They are trying to humiliate a living legend in a provincial courtroom over the length of his grass. They are trying to put one of the ghosts of Goose Green in a cage." He didn't wait for a reply. He strode towards the door, Captain Evans practically jumping out of his way. "Sir?" Evans said, following him out into the hall. "What shall I tell the General's office about the 1500 hours conference call?" "Tell them it's been cancelled," Blackwood snapped, already shrugging off his jacket as he marched down the corridor. "Tell them I'm going to fix an injustice. Tell them a life debt is being repaid." Back in the courtroom, the sudden departure of the young trainee solicitor had caused a minor ripple of disruption. Heads had turned, a few people had muttered, and it was all the ammunition Judge Davies needed. He saw it as the final straw, a direct consequence of the old man's stubborn refusal to play by the rules. His court, his perfectly controlled theater of authority, was descending into chaos, all because of this one silent, infuriating man. The judge's face, which had been a mask of irritation, now hardened into a cold, determined fury. His patience, thin as it was, had finally snapped. He slammed his gavel down on its wooden block. The sharp crack echoed through the room, making everyone jump and silencing the whispers instantly. "That is quite enough," he boomed, his voice resonating with an indignation he had clearly been storing up all morning. "This is not a circus. This is a court of law, and my courtroom will have order." He fixed his gaze on Arthur, a look of profound and personal animosity in his eyes. "Mr. Pendleton, I have given you every conceivable opportunity to engage with these proceedings. I have treated you with a patience that, I can assure you, I would not have extended to a younger man. In return, you have offered nothing but monosyllabic answers, insolent silence, and a demeanor that amounts to nothing less than a calculated insult to the laws this great nation is built upon." He took a breath, puffing out his chest as he prepared to deliver the killing blow. "Your silence is contempt. Your attitude is contempt. Your very presence has become an act of contempt. I hereby find you guilty of contempt of court." A collective, quiet gasp went through the small crowd. Finch, the prosecutor, allowed himself a small, triumphant smirk. This was it. The stubborn old man was finally getting what he deserved. But the judge wasn't finished. The punishment needed to be more than a simple fine. It had to be a lesson. It had to break the old man's spirit. He pointed a trembling finger at the bailiff, a burly, middle-aged man named Dave, who had been standing uncomfortably by the wall throughout the entire exchange. "Bailiff, take this man into custody. He will spend 48 hours in the county jail to reflect on the importance of respecting our legal system." Then he added the final unforgivable humiliation, his voice dripping with spite. Furthermore, given his clear inability to manage his own affairs, or even participate in a simple court proceeding, I am ordering a full competency evaluation to be carried out by social services. Clearly, this man is no longer fit to live independently. It was the ultimate overreach, a disgusting abuse of power. He wasn't just punishing Arthur. He was trying to strip him of his life, his autonomy, his very identity. He was trying to turn a proud, independent man into a ward of the state. The bailiff, Dave, looked as if he'd just been ordered to kick a puppy. His face was a picture of reluctance and shame. He approached the dock slowly, his heavy boots seeming to drag on the floor. He stopped in front of Arthur, deliberately avoiding eye contact. "Sir," he mumbled, his voice low and apologetic. I'm real sorry about this. You have to come with me now." Arthur Pendelton did not argue. He did not protest. He simply looked at the bailiff, and in his pale blue eyes there was not fear, but a flicker of something that looked almost like pity. He had faced down men who wanted to kill him with bombs and bayonets. He had endured more pain and loss than Judge Davies could ever conceive of. A holding cell and a patronizing social worker were just one more thing to endure. With a quiet resignation, his shoulders still ramrod straight, he turned and prepared to be led away like a common criminal. The small crowd watched in stunned, horrified silence. The injustice of it was a poison, thick and heavy in the air, and nobody knew how to stop it. Hope was gone. The bailiff hesitantly raised his hand, about to place it on Arthur's arm. Boom! The great double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with a sound like a shotgun blast, slamming against the stoppers on the wall. The sound was so violent, so utterly unexpected, that people physically cried out in shock. Every single head in the room snapped towards the entrance. Framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright light of the hall, stood a figure of such immense and immediate authority that the very atmosphere in the room changed. It was a brigadier of the British Army, immaculate in his dark green No. 1 dress uniform. A polished Sam Brown belt crossed his chest. A rainbow of medal ribbons spoke of a lifetime of service and valor. On his shoulders, the single gleaming star of his rank seemed to burn under the fluorescent lights. Flanking him stood his aide, Captain Evans, looking equally imposing. The brigadier's presence was a physical force. It sucked the air from the room and replaced it with a silence so profound it felt like a pressure against the eardrums. Judge Davis's jaw dropped, a comical O of disbelief on his face. The prosecutor, Finch, froze with his smirk half-formed. The bailiff, Dave, snatched his hand back from Arthur's arm as if he'd touched a live wire, taking a hasty step backwards. Brigadier James Blackwood strode into the room. He did not rush. He walked with the precise, rhythmic cadence of a man marching onto the parade ground, his polished boots clicking on the lino with a sound that was sharp, clear, and utterly dominant. He did not look at the judge. He did not look at the prosecutor. He did not look at the stunned faces in the gallery. His eyes, cold and hard as chips of flint, were locked on one person and one person only, the old man in the worn tweed jacket. He marched down the central aisle, the small crowd of spectators parting before him as if by an invisible force. He came to a halt 2 feet in front of Arthur Pendelton. In the deafening, electric silence of the courtroom, he brought his heels together with a sharp crack that echoed like a rifle shot. Then he raised his right hand to the brim of his service cap in a salute so crisp, so precise, so full of unwavering conviction, it seemed to cut the very air. It was not a gesture of greeting. It was a gesture of profound, absolute, and unconditional respect. The image was so profoundly jarring, so utterly outside the normal run of things, that for a long moment nobody in the courtroom could process what they were seeing. A one-star general of the British Army, in full ceremonial dress, standing to attention and saluting a frail old man in a worn tweed jacket. Brigadier Blackwood held the salute for a full 5 seconds, his arm as steady as a granite column. Then he spoke, his voice clear and strong, resonating with a power that made the judge's gavel seem like a child's toy. "Sergeant Pendleton," he said, the words echoing in the stunned silence. "It is an honor, sir." He didn't call him Arthur. He didn't call him Mr. Pendleton. He called him by the rank he had held in a different life, a life of mud and blood and unbelievable courage. And he called him Sir, a subordinate's title, offered as the ultimate mark of respect from a general to a sergeant. Arthur looked at the brigadier, and for the first time that day, a flicker of something other than weariness moved in his eyes. It was a glimmer of recognition, of a shared and distant past. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. Judge Davies, finally rebooting from the shock, found his voice. It came out as a sputtering, indignant squawk. "Brigadier, what is the meaning of this intrusion? This is a court of law. You have no standing here. I demand you explain yourself." Brigadier Blackwood slowly lowered his salute. But he did not turn his back on Arthur. He kept his body positioned between the old soldier and the judge's bench, a human shield of honor. He addressed Davies by turning his head slightly, his voice dropping to a dangerously low and cutting tone that was far more intimidating than any shout. "My standing, Your Honor," he began, "is as an officer in His Majesty's Armed Forces, and my meaning is to prevent a catastrophic miscarriage of justice and the public humiliation of a national hero." His voice rose again, not in volume but in a declarative force that commanded the absolute attention of every soul in the room. "The man you were about to place in a cage for an unkempt lawn is Sergeant Arthur Pendelton, of the 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment." He took a half step to the side, gesturing towards Arthur. "This man, who you have accused of disrespect and a contemptuous attitude, holds the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his actions during the Battle of Goose Green, an award, I might add, second only to the Victoria Cross." A wave of shock rippled through the gallery. Phones were being raised, no longer trying to be subtle. People were recording. Liam Connor, who had slipped back inside the courtroom, stood by the doors, tears welling in his eyes as he watched the scene unfold. The brigadier was just getting started. He also holds 2 military medals for gallantry under extreme fire at Wireless Ridge and Mount Tumbledown. He was wounded 3 times in the space of 72 hours, and 3 times he refused evacuation by helicopter to remain on the line with the men under his command. Blackwood took a step towards the bench, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. At Goose Green, after his platoon commander and platoon sergeant were killed, he took command. His men called him the Ghost, because for 3 hours he held the northern approach to the settlement virtually single-handedly, appearing and disappearing through the smoke of battle, to coordinate fire and drag the wounded to safety. His actions that day saved the lives of over 30 men who were cut off and surrounded. The prosecutor, Finch, had gone the color of chalk. He looked as if he was about to be physically sick. He was staring at Arthur not as a defendant, but as if he were a figure from a history book suddenly come to life. The brigadier pointed a finger at the small tarnished pin on Arthur's lapel. "And that pin," he snarled, his eyes locking onto the judge's, "that prize from the local bowls club you so casually mocked, that is his Pegasus pin, the symbol of his regiment. He doesn't wear it for himself. He wears it in memory of the 12 men from his platoon who did not come home from the South Atlantic. 12 men. Men who died by his side. Men whose names I am willing to bet he can still recite from memory 40 years later." He finally turned his full body to face the judge. His stare was so intense it felt as if it could crack the polished oak of the bench. "You sit there behind that crest and you demand respect for your robe. This man, this quiet man you have spent the morning bullying, earned this nation's eternal respect with his character, his courage, and his blood. He has stood before enemies far more terrifying than you, and he never once faltered. And you dare to question his fitness and lecture him on compliance?" Judge Davies was utterly broken. He had shrunk in his high-backed chair, his face a mottled canvas of shock, embarrassment, and dawning, gut-wrenching horror. He looked as if he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. His authority, his courtroom, his entire world had been dismantled in less than 3 minutes by a truth he had been too arrogant to even consider. The brigadier turned back to the old soldier. His voice softened. the fury replaced by a gentle, profound reverence. "Sergeant, on behalf of a grateful nation, I apologize for the indignity you have suffered here today." Arthur Pendelton finally spoke. His quiet voice cut through the electric silence more effectively than any shout. He looked not at the brigadier, but at the utterly shattered judge. "It's all right, Brigadier," he said, and there was a weary grace in his words. "The man was just doing his job. He sees a world of rules. I saw a world without them." He then looked directly at Judge Davies, his eyes holding not malice, but a deep, sorrowful wisdom. "Sometimes the quietest people are carrying the heaviest things. You just have to be willing to listen for what isn't being said." As Arthur spoke those words, a final image flashed in his mind's eye, the bedrock of his silence. He was on his knees in the freezing mud of a blasted hillside. A young soldier, a boy from Liverpool, barely 19 years old, was dying in his arms, his uniform soaked in blood. It was the boy who had given him a spare pin after he'd lost his own. With his last rattling breath, the soldier had pressed it into Arthur's hand. "Don't let them forget us, Sarge," he'd whispered. "Promise me." Arthur's hand had closed around the pin, a silent promise made in a crucible of loss. His silence in the courtroom hadn't been defiance. It was a vigil. The brigadier gently placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Let's go home, Sergeant." Brigadier Blackwood led Arthur Pendelton down the central aisle, his hand resting gently on the old soldier's shoulder. As they moved, the stunned silence in the courtroom finally broke. A single person in the public gallery, a middle-aged woman with tears in her eyes, began to clap. Then another joined in, and another, until the entire room, from the law students to the bailiff, was filled with a wave of thunderous, heartfelt applause. It was an apology. It was a thank you. It was a long overdue standing ovation for a hero who had never sought one. As they reached the great double doors, Arthur paused and looked back. He saw the broken figure of Judge Davies alone and utterly diminished on his high bench. He saw the ashen-faced prosecutor staring at his shoes. And he saw the young man, Liam Connor, standing by the door, his face a mixture of relief and awe. Arthur gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of thanks before turning and walking out into the daylight, a free man. In the days that followed, the story exploded. The mobile phone footage, shaky but devastatingly clear, went viral. It was picked up by every major news outlet. "Falklands hero humiliated in court over garden," screamed the headlines. The clip of the brigadier's salute and his furious, righteous speech played on a loop on the evening news. The public outcry was immediate and immense. The fallout was swift. The Judicial Conduct Investigations Office launched a full review into Judge Davies' behavior, and he was suspended indefinitely, his career in ruins. The Oakhaven Town Council, facing a torrent of fury from across the country, dropped all charges against Arthur and issued a groveling public apology. The overgrown garden at 24 Chestnut Lane had become a national symbol of a bureaucracy that had lost its heart. 2 weeks later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Liam Connor found himself walking down Chestnut Lane. He'd been unable to get the old soldier out of his mind. He felt he owed the man a proper explanation, an apology on behalf of a system that had so profoundly failed him. He found number 24 and stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The garden was no longer an overgrown wilderness, but it wasn't a pristine council-approved lawn either. Instead, a group of 4 young men in army fatigues were working in the garden with a quiet, focused reverence. One was carefully mending the sagging fence, replacing the rotten slats with fresh, sturdy wood. Another was on his hands and knees, not just pulling weeds from around the magnificent old rose bush, but carefully turning the soil, tending to it. A third was mowing the lawn, but not with a roaring petrol mower. He was using an old-fashioned push mower, the gentle whirring of its blades the only sound in the peaceful afternoon. They were soldiers, young men from the local barracks, their faces fresh and earnest. They worked with the gentle precision of sons tending to a beloved family home. And there, on the small porch, sat Arthur Pendelton. He was in a simple wooden chair, a steaming mug of tea cradled in his hands. He was watching the young soldiers, and on his face was a look of profound and weary peace. For the first time, a faint, gentle smile touched his lips. Liam hesitated, feeling like he was intruding on a sacred moment. But Arthur had seen him. He beckoned him over. "Mr. Connor," Arthur said, his voice calm and welcoming. "I was hoping you might stop by. There's another mug in the kitchen if you'd like a cuppa." "Liam, please," he said, walking up the path. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened, for what that judge—" Arthur held up a hand, silencing him. "You have nothing to be sorry for, son. You did a good thing, a brave thing." "You reminded them. The brigadier sent them, didn't he?" Liam asked, gesturing towards the young soldiers. Arthur nodded, a look of deep affection in his eyes as he watched them work. "He did. Quietly. No fuss. That's his way. That's the Army's way. Respect isn't about shouting. It's about doing." He took a sip of his tea, his gaze fixed on the Evelyn's Glory rosebush, now free of the nettles that had choked it. "My wife, Evelyn," he said softly. "She made me promise to let the garden go wild for a bit after she passed. Said she wanted it to remember her. I suppose I kept that promise a little too well." He looked at Liam, his pale blue eyes clear and full of a wisdom that went beyond his years. "I think she'd be happy now. It's not just tidy. It's being cared for. There's life in it again." Liam stood there, watching the old soldier and the young soldiers, a bridge of honor spanning the generations. The garden was no longer a monument to grief. Tended by the quiet hands of respect, it had become what it was always meant to be, a living, breathing testament to a love that never faded. True honor, Liam realized, was not found in the thunder of a courtroom gavel, but in the gentle whir of a lawnmower, in a mended fence, and in a simple cup of tea shared on a quiet autumn afternoon. It's easy to walk through our busy lives and see only the surface of the people we pass. We see an old man in a worn jacket, a quiet neighbor, a face in the crowd. Arthur Pendelton's story is a powerful reminder that beneath the quietest exteriors can lie the most extraordinary histories. It draws a stark line between the loud, hollow noise of fleeting authority and the quiet, unbreakable dignity of lived experience and sacrifice. We are surrounded by living history, by men and women who have walked through chapters of our collective story that we have only ever read about in books. Their battles may be long over, but their courage, their losses, and their honor remain, carried silently through the decades. This story asks us to look a little closer, to listen a little harder, not just to the words people say, but to the stories they don't. It suggests that the truest measure of a person isn't found in their title or the volume of their voice, but in the grace with which they carry their past and the quiet integrity they live by every day. The world is full of Arthur Pendeltons, and their stories are precious. If this story of quiet strength and overdue justice resonated with you, please consider sharing it. Your simple act of sharing helps to honor all our unassuming veterans and ensures these vital stories of courage are never forgotten. A like helps this video find its audience, and by subscribing, you join a community dedicated to remembering the tales that truly matter. Thank you for listening.